you noticed that times are just hard? It's not easy to feel hopeful after reading the news these days. I feel particularly concerned about young adults, including college-age women, and what does their future look like? Welcome to Gyno Curious. I am Dr. Amy Novat, the creator and host of the show. From both sides of the speculum, we're here to investigate what it means to be a healer and to be healed. Please let us know your questions and comments at gynocurious@gmail.com or comments at radiofreerhiniecliff.org. Please share the show with your friends and comment on whatever app platform you listen to podcasts. So today's guest is Dr. Wendy Freedman. She's the Director of Counseling Services at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Wendy earned her bachelor's degree at Cornell University, majoring in human development and family studies, and her doctorate in clinical and school psychology at the University of Virginia Curry School of Education. For the last 10 years, she's worked as the director of the Vassar College Counseling Services. She's a certified group psychotherapist and is a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force of the American Group Psychotherapy Association. Wendy, I am so grateful you're here with me today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
My pleasure. So I like to start the conversation on Gyno Curious speaking about kind of the arcs of our careers. And so could you tell us a little bit about kind of how did you get to Vassar and psychotherapy, and did you always want to be a therapist?
Yeah, this is a great question. You know, from the time I was very young, I just had a fascination with how people worked, how their minds worked, trying to understand them. I used to spend hours with my own mom sitting and processing and trying to make sense of the world around me. And it was actually when I was in high school that she said to me, have you ever thought about the field psychology? And when I learned about it, I discovered that there was an entire field dedicated to what I naturally was drawn to anyway. So it felt really like a natural fit for me. And I was hooked from the very beginning. So I'm one of those lucky people who found my calling right from the beginning. So every psychology class I took just, excited and interested me more and really found my way. And particularly working with people in a counseling realm, it really speaks to my spirit. I really feel that kind of intimacy and connection is really an opportunity that I feel like I can really make a difference in a way that's very meaningful to me. So I discovered college counseling as a postdoctoral fellow and really fell in love, and then have been with college counseling ever since.
So I'm so glad to hear that your aspirations and career goals were kind of crystallized at a very young age. It's not actually terribly common.
No, it's not at all.
Yeah.
No.
And you probably bear witness to this every day as you talk to college kids. But what I love about your story, too, is that you were speaking to your mom about this. You must have a pretty special mom.
I have very special parents.
Oh.
I really feel very fortunate.
Yeah.
And I do think having that fortune to grow up in a situation where I felt loved in that way and supported infuses the work that I do, in terms of the connection and the attachment and working with the clients that I work with and trying to provide a healing space for them in that way, very much mirroring some of the support that I felt growing up.
Yeah. Is anyone in the family in the world of psychotherapy?
Interestingly, no. I come from a long line of teachers.
Oh,
so I think there's actually a lot of overlap in that, right?
Yes.
And I see myself as a different form of a teacher, but a lot of public school teachers all the way in both sides of my family.
Are you a mom?
I am a mom, yeah. I have 2 children in high school, one who's graduating and about to head to college himself. Yeah, so I know this from both sides.
Yes. I like that about this middle age, is really being able to look at perspectives from both sides. Hence, for me, it's the 2 sides of the speculum, but it's a metaphor for the perspective of looking at kind of all sides, if you will.
Absolutely. And I know it really enhances the work that we do with college students as a parent. Knowing that side of what parents struggle with, right, allows us to work with and guide students in a way that we can hold the full picture.
Yeah. I want to come back to the role of parenting when it comes to the psychological status, mental health in college students. But one of the things I wanted to look up before we chatted was, okay, so how many college-age women, and pardon me, I'm talking about cis, trans, non-binary, when I use the term women, how many people are we talking about? And so according to the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, in the fall of 2022, about 8.3 million women were undergraduate college students, just in comparison to 6.1 million men, which alone is quite interesting. I mean, we know that more and more women are going to college than men. That's a whole nother conversation.
Right.
Today, I want to kind of focus on women because that's who I see in my office. And I wanted to be able to, again, have us look at the different perspectives from a gynecologist versus a psychotherapist. So one of the things that I've noticed when I see these young folks in my office is, one, I love this group of people.
They're fantastic, aren't they?
Oh my God, they make me laugh. They make me inquire. They always make me think. And I just so value that. But I've noticed, certainly over the last few years, that they seem to be struggling more, both from a physical point of view and emotional one. And I want to speak to those emotional challenges because as a clinician who focuses so much on the body, often what I think is true for some of these folks is that they're so struggling emotionally, psychologically, that they're having these somatic events. And that the soma, the body, is not the first part of this experience, or it is the first part, but it's about unexplored emotional territory. So with that in mind, do people in your world, do you talk about kind of college age being a developmental stage, or are we past those stages?
Yes, no, we speak about the stage of emerging adulthood. It's been a term that we've developed over the past number of decades to really capture where we are currently, in that there's this period, it's like an elongated adolescence, right? Where transitioning to becoming an adult is an extended process. And it really has a number of different developmental stages, and each one of them has important milestones that they reach, and really being able to give people the time they need to develop in that way has been very critical. And I think what we're seeing in terms of mental health are the students hitting particular challenges during that time and not necessarily having the supports or guidance that they need to help them navigate it successfully.
So if you would unpack that emerging adulthood, is there an age range that we can think about? And do college age kids experience this developmental stage very differently from those who don't choose to go to college? So let's talk about just the age range first.
Right. So when we think about emerging adulthood, we tend to think of the upper adolescence, so maybe in the 17, 18 year range, through the early 20s, right? And we know that the brain development continues into about age 26, right? So that period of time is really the time we're speaking about. And you'll hear people speak about this in sort of a less research-based way of, I don't understand. It seems that, students in their 20s are still struggling to try to find themselves. And right, you hear that.
Yes.
And it really is that age range, that it's taking a little bit longer for people to get to a place where they feel fully independent, where they feel fully, solid in themselves in a way that we might have expected in the past to happen at an earlier stage.
Do you understand why that's true? Or is that just perception, or are we truly seeing that in the world of psychotherapy and the offices where mental health is being cared for?
I think there's truth that shifted over time, and I think some of that has to do with cultural expectations and exposure, right, that our young people have. And I do think we can talk about this. I do think there have been some cultural shifts in parenting and other aspects that have contributed as well. So I think at every stage, people were still developing and engaging in identity formation in their 20s. It's just the circumstances around, I think, have shifted.
So why don't we go there right now? Why don't we talk about what those cultural shifts are and about parenting? And you get to choose what we start with.
Okay. Well, I think they're very related.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So what we know is that suffering and struggle is a part of human experience.
Amen.
Right? There's just no way around it, right? And we all go through periods of significant distress in our lives, right? So what we've noticed is a cultural shift happening in parenting in general. And of course, families are different and people, everyone's different. But in general, we've noticed a shift where there's an expectation for parents to smooth out the process for students and to try to help manage it in a way to reduce their children's suffering, right? So the analogy I like to use, it's a little bit playful, thinking about the sport curling that you hear in Canada.
That's funny, yes.
Right, where there's in front of the, I don't know what it's called, on the ice, there's the equipment, and then there's somebody in front who's sort of smoothing out the ice,
brushing
it,
or grooming it or something like that.
Right, trying to smooth it out so it can just
that's a
soothe
great analogy.
along.
Yep.
So I think out of the best of intentions and out of deep compassion and love for our children, what we're doing is trying to smooth out the journey in front and to reduce suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And again, coming from a very good place. And it's become the cultural norm to the point where if you're not doing that, it can be seen as neglectful.
Yeah, interesting.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But what's happening is by us engaging it to such a degree, we're communicating, I think, inadvertently or unintentionally to our young people that they can't handle the struggle and suffering. So we're having to rescue them from it or prevent it from happening. Right, which is a very different style than allowing, people to struggle and to suffer, but standing next to them and helping them to see how resilient they are in navigating that. So we're communicating unintentionally, this is not something that you can handle, I need to do this for you. And I really think as much as it's coming from a place of love, in some ways that's a real disservice.
Right.
Because we're not helping people see that suffering and struggle is actually the opportunity for growth and transformation and resilience, right? And then we're also not equipping ourselves with the coping strategies that we need to be able to handle when those things are going to happen in our lives.
Inevitably.
Right?
Inevitably. Yeah.
And I think this is linked in part also to why we're seeing a significant increase in suicidal ideation and self-injury in young people. That if you're suffering and feeling distressed, if you're overwhelmed, if you're in a lot of pain, you're trying to find ways to cope with that, right? If you do, and really self-injury and suicidal thoughts are coping strategies. When people feel overwhelmed, when they feel burdened, when they feel like they don't know what to do, those become coping strategies, especially when they're surrounded by peers and others that are using those as coping strategies. They become easily accessible, right? So if we're providing them with emotion regulation skills, distress tolerance skills, interpersonal effectiveness skills, then when they do suffer, as they will, there are things they can use, right? And if we build that into the lexicon and the understanding in our culture, then we can help each other in those ways. When we don't have that because our experience has been other people stepping in and trying to manage things for us without us being a partner in that, then we're left really not knowing how to handle that, right? And we're much more quick, it's quicker to go to these other strategies that are understandable and also very dangerous and painful.
Of course. And is it accurate to say particularly more dangerous in the emerging adulthood where, again, the brain isn't fully formed, where we don't have kind of the full array of coping mechanisms that we might have as an older adult?
Certainly.
Yeah.
But I do want to say, even among adults, we're seeing the rises, right, in mental health concerns and in really reduction in coping strategies, higher rates of suicide. So I think this is really an intergenerational problem.
Interesting.
But it is certainly something that's prevalent among this age group. I think in part also because this age group naturally deals with a lot of distress and suffering as they're trying to figure out who they are and dealing with the stresses in their lives.
Right. So I want to make sure we talk about the role of social media in this phenomenon.
Yes.
But I think before that, I want to ask, so, it's obvious to me that when a woman goes off to college, that certainly one of the triggering events is maybe this is the first time they've ever left home.
Right.
But what would you say are the other perhaps triggering events that make college experience particularly unique?
Right. So I think students or young people are trying to figure out who they are. That's such a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
So they're in an identity struggle when they're in high school. And then they get to college and everything changes around them, right? So the things that they might have thought that they knew about themselves in high school certainly are in question, right? am I capable? What are my skills? What are my talents? How do I compare to my peers? I thought I was good at this. I'm not so good at this, right? Totally different social situations, totally different expectations, right? It rocks their world, right? So they have to rediscover who they are in this new environment and space, but without the family or other friends that they had developed, right? Starting over again, right? So just as you're dealing with this transition of a new environment, you also don't have the support system that you used to have, right? So that's a really significant change.
Yeah. Boy, do I remember those years. They are painful and hard and kind of delightful too.
Yes.
If one, has the coping mechanisms and finds the support system. I think so many of us actually find some of our deepest relationships in our college experience.
Well, that's to speak to the resilience. And I want to say that, for our young adults, even with the struggles that they have, what really is remarkable to me is how they can really thrive, and just like you said, they're the most delightful population to work with because they're insightful and thoughtful and funny and really, as much as this process is difficult, when the supports are available, it becomes a moment of transformation that can really make their life course beautiful and rich, in lovely ways, which is why this work is so rewarding.
Yeah.
Right? If we can work with students to support them in accessing what they need to really thrive, the sky's the limit for them. Right.
So let's just go. I have so many questions, but I want to make sure we talk about social media because it's had so much impact on all of our lives.
Yep.
But I think it's true. I actually didn't look up the statistics, but people of that age group are using social for so many reasons. Can we talk about social media and how you see it in your day-to-day impacting these women?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so we know that our current young generation, right, has grown up with social media from a very early part of their development, right? So this is all that they've known in their social networks, as opposed to some of the older generations where it came along later, right? So during those formative years, we didn't have access to that.
Yeah.
And it's really complicated. It's both a blessing and a curse. It's both, right?
Yes.
So on the one hand, it opens up opportunity for people to stay connected and meet new people, even not in their geographic location, to connect to people who have shared identities in different spaces, to normalize. So there's so many wonderful things that come from it. But we also know that there are real challenges, right? In the way that social media is, the way people portray themselves. It's really difficult to get an accurate sense of who people are, right?
Yeah.
And so in that natural stage of development where young people are comparing themselves to their peers, that's not a very good base of comparison when they're comparing themselves through only the lens, or primarily the lens of social media, right?
Right.
And they also can hear and learn about things that can be difficult or problematic for them too. So I don't know that having social media is the problem as much as how much social media is consumed and how much of a focus there is. The research is very clear. Studies have shown a correlation between smartphone addiction and anxiety and depression, as well as a correlation between heavy social media use and depression, anxiety, loneliness, and suicidal ideation.
I was listening to Esther Perel speak, and she coined this term, rather than AI, it's artificial intimacy.
Absolutely.
Isn't that brilliant?
It's brilliant.
And I kind of all these false friends that people have on, whether it's Instagram or Facebook or et cetera, and how confusing that is, right?
Yes.
So when someone, how does it manifest in your office? Like what's the presentation look like, if you will?
So I think what we're seeing is a deep state of loneliness.
Yes.
That young people, and not just young people, but young people are surrounded by people and still feeling lonely.
The NIH said that loneliness was the #1 psychological problem in this country.
I believe it. I believe it. I see it in my practice. I see it among, colleagues. I see it in the world, that there's a way that we've moved away from the deep, vulnerable, meaningful connections that we form, right? And it's the vulnerability that I think is the key piece of that. It's scary to learn to be vulnerable with people, right? And there's a way that social media keeps us a bit at a distance where we can, again, be with people, but not really be with people. And I think that loneliness and disconnection can happen. It takes away that sense of intimacy and belonging and that deeper connection that happens with vulnerability. So that's actually a big part of what we see our role as in the counseling center, at Vassar. A lot of group therapy, really trying to provide an opportunity for people to learn how to open up in that deeper, more vulnerable way. It's quite scary for them, but it's hugely healing when they can do it. And then once you get a taste of what that kind of relationship can be like, people might be more willing to try to take that risk in other spaces.
It so reminds me as part of the analogy used with curling.
Yes.
If vulnerability is one of those bumps on the icy track that you just keep smoothing out because all you're doing is having relationships online, that when someone comes and looks you in the eye, I'm sitting here, speaking to Wendy, and we're staring at one another. And I'm reminded, literally, we're looking at each other in the eye. And I'm reminded how so few of these young people who come into my office are really able to do that.
Right.
They might be asking really probing questions, but looking me in the eye, they're not familiar with that form of communication.
Well, there's such a vulnerability.
Absolutely.
Right? And it's interesting that when we're talking about vulnerability in our groups and with our students, it's often around how to navigate conflict and also how to navigate closeness.
Yes.
Because this kind of closeness, sustained eye contact, it's a lot. It brings up a lot of feeling, right? And if you don't know what to do and if you're scared about that. And I do want to say, I think some of this is linked to, I think we're similarly struggling as a culture in knowing how to navigate conflict and difference, right? We really just are really struggling as we're seeing that playing out in our society, right?
Yes.
This idea of cancel culture people keep hearing about, right? That if I don't know how to navigate you, if you feel differently than me, if you have different, even though we have more in common as humans and we have different, we other each other, we block each other, we separate from one another, right? So invariably in relationships, there's going to be conflict. When you have two humans interacting with each other, you're going to run into areas that are difficult. If you haven't learned how to stay with each other, how to, instead of othering, how to really understand but compassionately where the other person is coming from and find ways to connect over those differences, it's going to lead to separations. It's going to lead to rifts in relationships. And so we're seeing that societally, and we're certainly seeing that among young people as well. They don't know how to navigate conflict as in general, right? Where if there's some sort of problem that comes up, relationships end, right? As opposed to work through. Now, again, that's a blanket statement. There are a lot of young adults who can do this and do this beautifully, but we are seeing this struggle. And I really wish not only for our young people, but for our society as a whole, that we could really work on this and figure out how to see each other more fully as humans.
Yeah. It reminds me that in my world, often when I learn a new skill set, I start small and then I expand upon it. So bear with this corollary that may or may not be apt. Wendy, college is a very insular place. It's a microcosm. And there's a beauty and a challenge to that. So I see college as an opportunity for these people to kind of experiment with vulnerability, love, sex, etc., in a kind of a safe place. At the same time, maybe it's too insular. Can we talk about that paradox? Because it feels a little confusing to me.
Yes, it's interesting. I actually have had these conversations in my own family with my son as we were trying to figure out what size school for him to go to, right? That on the one hand, a small school has the safety and the intimacy, but on the other hand, it's not very forgiving if things go wrong.
Interesting.
Especially in our current culture, this idea of cancel culture, right? Where the word spreads and people know who you are. And, right, there's not a lot of room for forgiveness or compassion.
Yeah.
But also if it's so big that you feel like you get lost in that, right? So how to navigate that, I think, is a very complicated thing.
Yeah.
And you'll see young people making different decisions about where they're going, I think in part related to this question.
Yeah.
Right? Of what feels safer, in quotes, right? What feels safer to them? Does a small, intimate environment feel safer, or do they actually feel safer in a larger environment?
Yeah, yeah. big fish, small pond,
Yes.
et cetera. Yeah.
Right, right.
And boy, that's not always obvious to us when we're 15 and 16 and
certainly
applying for
isn't.
schools or picking a job or any of those things. So I
Right.
can appreciate, I kind of just had this new perspective on why kids might transfer. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why they
yes.
might, but one may be this discovery of the largesse or the smallness of a community is just not working out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think having the room to grow and make mistakes and figure it out is an important developmental process.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess just to put it out there, is it true that there is more mental illness in this cohort like there is in the rest of our society? Or are we just better at identifying it?
So a few things I think about it. One, the stresses of the world certainly are affecting people, right, in a lot of different ways. I do also think we're getting better at identifying the struggles that folks are having, right? I'm actually a little bit concerned about, let me speak, it's complicated. On the on the one hand, the awareness and the reduction of stigma is hugely important because we know early prevention is critical in terms of people having an access to care is critical in people having good outcomes, right?
And normalizing,
And
right?
normalizing, absolutely.
Just saying, hey,
Absolutely.
I am depressed and not feeling isolated, being able to say it out loud, which is what I'm observing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's so many benefits to that. One of the challenges we're seeing, though, is the pathologizing of human experience. So it's not that I went through these very difficult things. Someone I love died, or I went through a breakup, and now I'm going through this difficult thing, and I'm going to get support, and I'm going to get through it, and I'll be okay. It's I have depression, and I am a depressed person, is what we're seeing happening more with young adults, and that there is identity development happening where they're identifying around a diagnosis in a way that can sort of make it that it's difficult to sort of see these things as partly developmental, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I think certainly there's increases in struggle and suffering because of the environmental factors that are happening, but I also think people are attaching to diagnoses in a way that we didn't in the past.
Yeah.
And actually building community. Our young folks, there's a lot of conversation in peer groups. I have this disorder and I have this disorder, and so on the one hand, wonderful, right, that they're open and talking about it and getting support. On the other hand, can be difficult that so much of that is around attachment to labels and diagnoses because that feels permanent as opposed to the transient nature of mental health where there are times when we're doing better and times when we're doing worse. And it can make it harder to access the resilience in the times we're doing better.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that tendency is a response to the internet where so much of the way we correspond with people or communicate with people is by, again, tribal communication, group identity, if you will.
Right.
Yeah. Do you think, I had a question, it just went in and out of my brain, which it does during this midlife. I don't know.
Another natural developmental process.
Exactly. What does the woke culture error mean to you? Because I think we're kind of going there. We're interfacing with it a little bit. What does it mean to you?
Yeah. So when I hear the term woke culture, I think often what people are referring to is, especially in younger generations, a growing awareness of the struggles of other folks and more of a naming of that, right? A more of a speaking to it, naming of it, and also an insistence on trying to evolve or adjust to make spaces more supportive and accommodating for people from marginalized backgrounds, right? So what I mean by that is, the example I think of for myself is, as somebody who's able-bodied, right? We walk through the world and we don't think about the fact that we're able-bodied most of the time, right? Until we, are on crutches or in a wheelchair. And then suddenly it's very clear in the world, right? About, oh my gosh, there's so many spaces that are just not accessible at all, right? And once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? You just become aware of that. And I feel like this generation, because of their exposure, is becoming much more aware of all of the discrimination and the prejudice and all the things that a number of different marginalized groups are experiencing. And once they see it, they can't unsee it. And they feel pulled to speak to it and to try to change it, right? Which is actually overall a really good thing in helping our society progress, right? And for the folks who have been in marginalized backgrounds, it's hugely helpful for them to have other people speaking to this, right? And to calling for, joining in trying to help shift the world. And as we know, young people so much want to make the world a better place, right?
Indeed.
So they're very passionate about it. So woke culture, to me, I think is important to differentiate from cancel culture. Because I think sometimes they're merged, but I think they're different things, right? Woke culture is about becoming aware of what's happening and how certain groups are being treated and trying to call for change and bring people's attention to it. Cancel culture is more about the not having room for growth, right? And it makes sense to me that when people have been suffering a long time, it's very hard to be patient.
Absolutely.
Right? When you've been dealing with people, hurting you in pain over and over. And we know this, if there's someone in our life who's been very nasty and critical to us, they can say the littlest thing and we get really frustrated by it. That's a normal human reaction. That would be the case when you're dealing with constant discrimination and treatment, right? Of course you're going to be sensitive to that, right? So some of the ferocity we see around it is understandable, right? People have been in pain for a long time. The thing that's difficult is that if we're trying to shift society over time, when shame, right, can shut people down and make it so that they're not open for growth. So it's a real predicament we're in where people are in very understandable pain and have very understandable lack of tolerance, right, as it makes sense. And we have to help move people along, right? And this is really where allies can come into play, right? Where people who are not from the marginalized backgrounds can do some of that more we call in versus call out, right? Like helping people gently over time learn about these things and move in a direction that's more affirming.
So you basically answered the question that had left my brain, but what I was going to ask or posit is whether we are pathologizing, identifying with diagnoses like anxiety, depression, etc., because this is a group of people who have become so aware of the isms, and that in response to wanting to be empathic, wanting to support others, being overwhelmed by the heaviness of the racism, misogyny, ageism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that they've kind of glommed onto these diagnoses. In a way, it helps. It's not an ism anymore. There is a mental health ism. I don't know, but maybe it's a safe place or just a response. And I don't think people are aware of it, but I'm wondering whether, because I don't want to be racist, I don't want to be misogynistic, I don't want to be classist, I'm going to work against all that and be woke, but I'm feeling the weight of it, so I'm depressed.
Well, I think the reality is there's so much pain in the world.
Yeah.
There's so much pain and anytime we look at that honestly, it's very heavy. It's very heavy. It's overwhelming.
Yes.
Right? And it can cause us to just shut down.
Yeah.
Right? And I think a big part of social movement and progression is figuring out how do we stay open to seeing what's happening while also coping with that in a way that allows us to move forward. And I actually think a big part of that is about community, which we just spoke about is difficult right now in terms of loneliness and connection. But ultimately in social activism work, what allows someone to sustain over time, right, is finding people in your network, in your community, who you can help and support each other and be there. And it helps you feel less overwhelmed and less helpless, and you feel like you can actually make progression, right? Where things are possible, where it sustains hope, right? Which feels like such a critical thing in a time like this, when it's so easy to shut down, to not want to look at what's happening because we get flooded, right? But when we all shut down, that's when really bad things can happen in our society, right?
Absolutely. So, I was thinking about how communities can be so impervious, and that's not good either. You want a porous community, one that is able to have all perspectives, if you will, maybe share some identity, but able to embrace, again, the diversity. Which I'm going to ask us to shift a little bit, though it's aligned, is so in my office, again, what I'm speaking so often about is gender and sex and sexuality. How is that manifesting in your office around, the struggles that this group is working through?
Right. Well, we know this time, as we said, this time state, the stage of development is a time when people are really trying to figure out who they are, right? And struggling with identity. We know in the past, that gender and sexuality was always on a continuum, right? But there wasn't language or understanding of what that was. So people would feel off in our heteronormative, society, and it might have taken them years to figure it out, right? And they'd be really struggling within themselves, and it was just very challenging, right? So with the progress society has made, what's different now, young people, when they're figuring out who they are, these are just part of their questions of figuring out who they are. Am I somebody who likes, salty or sweet snacks? Am I someone who feels more, on this continuum, more masculine or feminine? It's just part of what they think about. So it's in that natural progression. I think people are surprised by it, thinking, why all of a sudden? It's just that there's more freedom to explore that.
Right.
How that lands in terms of students' mental health has to do with how supported an environment that they're in. Right? So as all folks are having those questions for themselves and thinking about that, or most folks are, if you're in a space or an environment around people who are supportive of you exploring that, who will accept you no matter who you are, it actually has very healthy mental health outcomes, right? People do really well and they thrive once they figure out who they are, and then they move into that. They tend to be very healthy. It's when they're experiencing rejection or when they're experiencing judgment that can really contribute to more negative mental health outcomes. And this is why we know, for example, the LGBTQ population has much higher rates of depression and suicidality. It's not because they're inherently not mentally well people, it's because they're living in society that are so often so rejecting of them, and that they're dealing with so much in terms of discrimination. So we see the difference, when I have a student who comes from a family who's very accepting and supportive of who they are, their outcomes are much better than students who are being, experiencing a lot of rejection and judgment. We do what we can to provide support, and we can shift outcomes by helping them build community where they are and chosen family and those sorts of things. But huge difference for them to be in a community that supports them.
Yeah. I certainly hope that colleges across this nation are doing their best to provide this support. I'm a little concerned, of course, about those states where we know LGBTQ communities are not supported in legislation, etc.
I can speak about that. So I'm connected to directors from counseling services across the country, and this is a huge topic of conversation. Yeah. We're seeing right now what's playing out in states where colleges and universities are being banned from providing support, guidance, education around these topics. The mental health outcomes are really problematic.
Yeah.
So we're actually contributing to our students doing worse in these settings, and people are really struggling to know what to do with that. How do you stay within the law? How do you and what I'm seeing is a lot of advocacy happening where my colleagues are trying to educate legislators in their various states about maybe the unintended impact of, that they might have one intention in setting the policy that they do without necessarily taking into account the fact that they might be leading to higher rates of suicide, higher rates of depression among young adults. So they're trying to help make that connection and showing from an empirical base how that's the case, hoping that that might allow for progress.
I must admit, I don't feel terribly hopeful right now about this because it feels so connected to choice and guns and, et cetera,
all
et
of
cetera.
It. Yep. Yeah.
So let's, for young folks that might be listening to this, I guess what I might say to them, and please correct me, when you're looking at schools to go to or cities to live in, work in, think about this issue too.
Yes.
Not only, we don't all have choices because there's financial strains, there's limitations of travel. Some people have to be day students, there's so many obstacles.
Right.
But if one has some freedoms to make choices, you need to look at this deeply, right?
Thinking about how, in general in your life, how do I put myself in an environment that will support me in being who I am and will also continue to open my mind to other possibilities, to learning about different people, right? Because the only way we'll move forward in the world is for us to remain connected to one another, right? So it's both and surrounding myself by communities that will support and encourage me to be myself and expose me to new possibilities, new ideas, so I can learn how to dialogue across difference.
Oh, I love that.
And even if you, because of circumstances, are in a school that might not be ideal in all the ways that you want, how do you look for the community within that school that will support you, that will help you to feel, not alone, will help you to allow to be vulnerable, to give you the resiliency, the hope that you need to navigate.
Yeah. Do most of the kids who come into the counseling services have group and individual therapy, or is it, how do you make that assessment?
It's a great question. We're really in an interesting time in college mental health, having been in the field for, over 20 years now. The needs are so high, the utilization rates are so high that we're all struggling how to figure out the balance between how to give quick access to students who need us right away versus ongoing treatment. And it's a real stretch and strain that we're trying to navigate. There's no easy answer. So individual therapy is something that a lot of students like. It's a very important modality. We certainly, offer that a lot. What we also know is groups are one of the most effective interventions in general, and particularly for this age group, because of all that things that we've spoken about today in terms of the loneliness, connection, vulnerability, all those things that really can help support a student and buffer them from some of the mental health impacts, the negative mental health impacts. Right. So there's a lot of effort to see about how to support people in college mental health to get more comfortable with group work and to lean into that more, and how to speak to students in a way, because it's scary for them to go into those spaces. It's scary for anybody to go into a group. But the outcomes are so positive. We usually find that if we can get them in the door, usually even after one group session, they say, they're just amazed by not feeling alone in the same ways, right? And then they're willing to stick with it.
Yeah.
So we're very fortunate at Vassar because, there are a few of us who are very immersed in group work, being a certified group psychotherapist. We have a very robust group therapy program. There are other colleges that do as well, and it's something that we're really working on to see how we continue to help build that.
Great. So we're moving towards the end of our podcast, and there's so many things to talk about, but I just want to speak as a parent to those listening who are parents. What would you say, in a kind of in an encapsulated way, are some ways in which we can make sure that the ice before our kids remain bumpy, so that they learn from those bumps, but also provide them loving support? And it's a huge question, and you and I could spend another podcast talking about it. But if you could just give some words of wisdom, because I suspect you have them.
I can certainly do my best.
That's all we can do here.
So I think a big part of it is holding the frame in your mind that you're walking beside your young person instead of in front of them, right? That our role, especially by the time that they're older in that way, is to really be someone who to try to make ourselves a safe person for them to speak to, right? So how to be able to hear things without judgment, very difficult as a parent, very difficult. How to hear things without judgment, to be supportive and validating, and then to help them problem solve and think through things, and then scaffold where they're the ones who are taking the steps versus us taking the steps for them. Very challenging. I'll just give a little example. I have a lot of students who come into my office who've never had to call a medical professional, and they're terrified to make a phone call.
Yeah.
Right?
Understandable.
Very scary.
Yeah.
So instead of making the call for them, right, we help them, support them in writing a script. Mm-hmm. They make the phone call while we sit next to them, cheering them on, right? And then afterwards, look at what you did. That's awesome, right? And we build their sense of that they can do it, right? Capacity, right? Their trust in themselves that they can do it.
Yeah.
So something like that is what we want to be doing for our young adults. We want to be cheerleading them, supporting them, validating them, and helping scaffold for them, thinking through the steps they need to take so they can be the ones who are navigating and can gain a sense of confidence and trust in who they are. We also really want to find ways to help give them skills about how to regulate their emotions, how to tolerate distress, how to handle conflict. Those are such critical skills, that our younger folks really don't have at this point, or at least not in the ways that we probably need them to.
Right.
So being able to have those conversations with them or help them access resources that can help them learn those skills, hugely impactful in terms of the long-term outcome. And really trying to build opportunities for natural, deeper relationships to form, right? Those vulnerable, natural relationships that help people to feel that sense of belonging is also really important.
I think that the greatest lessons my kids have taught me, and they're both in their later 20s, is that I validate how they're feeling, that I reassure them that they're not alone, that I've experienced it too. Mm-hmm. And what both of them have said over and over again, because I'm a natural teacher, this is what I do in my career, is they say, Mom, I just want to share with what's going on, but I don't want you to solve it for me.
Yes.
Stop trying to figure it out for me.
Right.
And I've gotten better. I'm not in any way perfect, but I hear them, and you're validating for me that what they're sharing with me is so important. I've got to let them suffer. I've got to let them fall, scrape their knees,
Right. It can be helpful to ask if they want problem solving.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah,
so if you first provide the support, the validation, the universality, you're not alone, and then would it be helpful? Would you like me to think through some solutions or not?
Right. Rather than jiving into it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I so admire the work that you do. And I think I'm going to have to invite you back because there's a lot that we didn't even cover. So at the end of the podcast, I like to focus on pleasure. And I want to ask you, what do you do to make sure that you have pleasure in your life?
I'm so glad that you asked that question. It's something that I'm talking to my colleagues about all the time, is our own wellness and resilience as helpers. Because there's a toll, right, in carrying all this, and how important it is to build that in. So my own pleasure. So not surprisingly, a lot of my pleasure comes from deep personal connections and relationships with people. Not just clients, but really with my friends, with my family, So I find that so restorative to, very deep, meaningful conversations about our lives and what's happening. So that's a core part of my joy and pleasure. I also love to dance.
Oh, right on.
It's such a free space, and in your body, it's just a wonderful release for me. So that's something that I really enjoy doing.
Great.
And actually, the other thing that brings me pleasure is my own activism work in the community. Because of what we've talked about, it gives me a sense of hope and purpose, and the community of other people who see the world or the direction that they'd like the world to go in a similar way and are willing to work hard with me on that. Really brings me such hope, even in dark times.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, may your life be abundant with all of those things.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And I so appreciate the invitation to come and speak with you.
It's my pleasure. I'm so grateful for you being here. I also want to thank my audience. I want to thank my co-producers, Jen Hammoud and Matty Rosenberg, and the Epicurean, this wonderful store in Rhiniecliff, New York, that so kindly provides a space for Radio Free Rhiniecliff. Until our next episode of Gyno Curious, please stay well and trust your intuitions and instincts. They are the greatest of teachers.